Right, welcome to the class on Chinese religions. Before we begin talking about Chinese religions, of course, we should talk about another theorist of religion. This one is Immanuel Kant. If you decide to get into philosophy, you will probably read him quite a bit, particularly if you have to be invested in the history of philosophy, because he's known really as the father of modern philosophy. A lot of these guys, typically they're German and always white, are fathers of some field. And like I said, with the founding fathers of religion, we have to be careful and not overly focus upon them, but they are important in the tradition nonetheless. He was a major contributor to the Enlightenment, particularly as the little bit later German Enlightenment took hold in the later 18th century and beginning of the 19th century. Kant's work and influence is vast, but I just want to kind of focus on his impact on the modern understanding of religion. Kant, along with Hume and Hegel, played a central role in the development of philosophy of religion as an area of inquiry distinct from the ways that late medieval and early modern philosophies had dealt with the concept of God. These earlier inquiries can be considered forms of, quote, philosophical theology. They applied human reason to concepts and claims about God for which Christian theology, understood as a systematic human reflection on divine revelation, served as the primary frame of reference for the truth of such claims. One important function of this kind of inquiry was to determine the extent to which human reason, operating without the assistance of divine revelation, could by its own power establish the meaning, validity, and truth of concepts and claims about God, or what was considered God. Philosophical theology had been primarily coordinated to the claims of Christian theology made on behalf of a divine revelation, and it was often used as an apologetic on behalf of the reasonableness of Christian beliefs. In contrast, philosophy of religion, as it began to take shape in the 18th century, began to function independently of formal theological inquiry and shifted its focus from religion as divinely revealed to religion as a human phenomenon. So there's this kind of wedge that develops between philosophy and religion. It can be kind of seen in line with what we've been distinguishing between the insider and outsider's perspective when understanding religion. However, it should be noted that even though a lot of these figures in the Enlightenment thought that they were engaging in a type of philosophy that wasn't beholden to or at the behest of any one religious tradition, a lot of their thought was still very much quote unquote Christian. And we'll get into that in another class in this course. Philosophy in this instance with Kant and others is no longer seen as the handmaiden of theology in the West, in which it once was. So Kant's major work was the Critique of Pure Reason that came out in 1781. It was a watershed moment for this new type of philosophy of religion. His arguments focus on the concepts of God and the soul, and they're primarily concerned to show their philosophical incoherence as they were articulated within those systems. So these notions were incoherent in that they were in principle not subject to the spatio-temporal framework necessary to constitute them as valid objects of experience for the legitimate speculative use of reason. Kant's arguments here do not directly bear upon the functions of notions of God and the soul within the complex structure of human religious belief and practice. He's nonetheless well aware that the conclusions drawn from his arguments in the first critique will have significant implications for articulating an understanding of religion appropriate to the finite reason that characterizes humanity's unique status at the juncture of nature and freedom. So what Kant really does in this really important philosophical work is he demonstrates that the arguments for God's existence are impossible. Kant's criticisms of the arguments for the existence of God, typically used in rationalist metaphysics, remain among the most influential elements of his heritage. This influence extends not merely to later discussions of these arguments in philosophy of religion, but also enters into views of the history of philosophy that see these criticisms as an important marker for, quote, the end of metaphysics. You'll encounter that phrase a lot in particularly postmodern philosophy. So yeah, Kant basically refutes arguments for the existence of God. They've been going on for some time. There's a lot of debate in scholarship these days if the arguments function the way in which these Enlightenment thinkers that they function, like were they actually there to prove to somebody that God exists? A lot of scholarship these days say that these arguments were not meant as arguments at all. A really famous case in point is Pascal's wager, that it's just better to bet on the existence of God than not. And obviously that's come under a lot of ridicule, even in his time, but also with the Enlightenment thinking and after. But a lot of scholarship these days say that those arguments like Pascal's were not about convincing anybody about the existence of God. That oftentimes these arguments were used as moral tools or moral transformation. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But more specifically, Kant capably critiqued the ontological argument for God's existence in his first critique. The first ontological argument in the Western Christian tradition was proposed by Anselm of Canterbury in his 1078 work. Now, ontology refers to being, existence. What does it mean to be? And so that's the study of existence. That's what ontology is. So an ontological argument is an argument that establishes existence, that establishes being from just what existence means, from what being is, or what it means to be. So Anselm defined God as, quote, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? So God's like all-powerful, all-knowing, nothing else can be conceived greater than God. Okay. And he argued that this being must exist in the mind. Well, obviously because we're thinking of it. So his next step to say, even in the mind of the person who denies the existence of God, he suggested that he, as an Anselm, if the greatest possible being exists in the mind, it must also exist in reality. If it only exists in the mind, then an even greater being must be possible, one which exists both in the mind and in reality. Therefore, this greatest possible being must exist in reality. So you can see how Anselm kind of makes a step that what it means to be, what existence means, and if we can conceive of a being that's the greatest possible being, that being must necessarily, because it's the greatest being and what it means to be, exist. If that's confusing, that's fine. And the exact minutia of that argument doesn't really need to be elaborated in this class. Needless to say that there have been some philosophers who have thought this is the most elegant argument for the existence of God ever created. In fact, there's a famous 20th century philosopher who was brought to tears when he first heard this argument. But in terms of Kant's critique of this argument, it's not necessary to kind of go into the details for right now, but it's important to note that with Kant's critique, God and by extension all religious phenomena are figured outside the realm of pure reason or philosophical reflection. So these things, like God or the soul, he calls them noumena, and they're only accessible through moral reasoning. So for Kant and his critique of something like Anselm's ontological argument, we cannot use reason, which is what Anselm tries to do, to establish the existence of these things, like the soul or like God, because those are phenomena, what he calls actually noumena, that reason cannot grasp. That our reason, and he didn't have the theory of evolution behind him, but because of the way in which our reason has developed, is incapable of grasping onto those sorts of things. So once the intellectuals in the West started criticizing religion, philosophy was kind of able to go its own way. So philosophers like Kant are able to kind of put this wedge in between philosophy and religion. And this has very fateful consequences. A lot of these Enlightenment thinkers and post-Enlightenment thinkers, the way in which they criticized religion was actually by employing a definition of religion that was entirely derived from the Reformation. Like I said, Luther really focuses on sola fide, of faith alone. And so what they do is they collapse the old distinction, the old Greek distinction of religio and superstitio. And so they say that all religion is superstition. Well, not all religion, because some of these Enlightenment thinkers are deists and think that they should hold on to some form of notion of God. But this type of religion is a reformational religion, or a post-Reformation religion. They think it's about private belief, and that's it. And ritual and art and everything else that's associated with the diversity of religion kind of gets wiped away. Of at least equal influence has been Kant's effort to analyze religion as fundamentally based on morality, though there is also significant disagreement about the correctness and the consequences of Kant's position. A common view is that Kant effectively reduces religion to morality without remainder. On this account, Kant's work functions as an important step in freeing humanity from the grip of dogmatic and ritualistic religion. So that has a lot of fateful consequences. Conceiving religion as morality. A lot of post-Enlightenment thinkers or Enlightenment thinkers themselves, like our own Thomas Jefferson, really buy into this kind of notion of religion, which helps us kind of start thinking about, and we'll come back to this kind of often, what's this definition of philosophy versus religion? Ask yourself, why is this class in the philosophy department? And what is the difference between philosophy and religion and philosophy and theology? Think of this school, or any school really, as an institution. As with any institution, there are institutionalized ideologies, thoughts, beliefs, values that are put into concrete reality and are systematized. E.g., certain classes are established and made routine and regular because some white males back in the day thought that this subject matter was important. So we should ask, why is this class here? Why is it in this department? More fundamentally, what is the difference between philosophy and religion, or philosophy and theology? What is philosophy? It's often said that philosophy is the love of wisdom. That's the etymology of the term. Philo means love. Sophie means wisdom. So it's love of wisdom. So the standard distinction is that philosophy is the search for truth based upon reason and rationality, whereas religion or theology is the search for truth based upon revelation or God or divine or whatever is one's ultimate concern. But this distinction doesn't really hold up when you look at it critically. What are we trying to say when we say that philosophy is based upon reason? What type of reason? What is reason? Is reason just another God? It's a question about foundations. What is the foundational support that grounds all of it? Think of a pyramid. What's at the bottom? What's at the base? What founds and grounds everything? Is the foundation of any system in and of itself like God or like the divine? So is there a foundation? Or, as the ancient Hindu tale would have it, is it all turtles all the way down? It will be helpful, particularly in the specific class, this one about Chinese religions, if we distinguish between Jie and Chao. These terms have the benefit of being native to the Chinese language rather than the Western imports of Confucianism and Taoism, which again are Western terms. Jie is usually described as a school of thought or a philosophy, whereas Chao is like a teaching or religion, as your textbook says. The former refers more to the great thinkers and their specific teaching, and the latter to the religious and, by extension, to the unique ways in which the great traditions have been appropriated by people at the grassroots level. A distinction between the great intellectual traditions and the cultic and devotional side of religious life has been made in all the Chinese traditions, Confucianism, Taoism, and also Buddhism. The Chinese traditions have never felt the need to contrast Jie and Chao in a hostile fashion. In a very characteristic way, they are said to represent two different parts of one continuum. They are different, yet they are related. So it will be helpful to kind of talk about shortly or briefly some Chinese history. The name China comes from the Sanskrit Sina, derived from the name of the Chinese Qin dynasty or Qin dynasty. It's pronounced Qin, although it's spelled Qin, which was translated as sin by the Persians and seems to have become popularized through the trade along the Silk Road from China to the rest of the world. The Romans and the Greek knew the country as Ceres, the land of silk, where silk comes from. The name China does not appear in print in the West until Marco Polo's time in the 16th century, early 16th century. In Mandarin Chinese, the country is known as Jianggu, meaning the central state or middle empire. The long history of China is often told through the succession of dynasties, as you can kind of see in the video there. One dynasty would supplant and overthrow another. One might incorrectly infer from viewing historical timelines that transitions between dynasties occur abruptly and or smoothly. Rather, dynasties were often established before the complete overthrow of an existing reign or continued for a time after they had effectively been defeated. For example, the conventional date 1645 marks the year in which the Qing dynasty armies overthrew the preceding Ming dynasty according to the dynastic cycle of China. However, the Qing dynasty was established in 1636 or possibly 1616, while the Ming dynasty lasted as a pretender until 1663. This change of ruling houses was a messy and prolonged affair, and the Qing took almost 20 years to extend their control over the whole of China. Most important for this class is that from this succession of dynasties comes the very important idea of Tianming, or the mandate or will of heaven. The idea is believed to have come about between the Shang and the Zhao dynasties. The mandate of heaven, or Tianming, is a Chinese political and religious doctrine used since ancient times to justify the rule of the king or the emperor, and also justify the eviction of a dynasty. According to this belief, heaven, which embodies the natural order and will of the universe, bestows the mandate on a just ruler of China, known as the Son of Heaven. If a ruler was overthrown, this was interpreted as an indication that the ruler was unworthy and had lost the mandate. It was also a common belief among citizens that natural disasters such as famine and flood were signs of heaven's displeasure with the ruler. So there are often revolts following major disasters, as citizens saw these as signs that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn from the current ruler. In relation to the mandate of heaven, there developed another idea that was to have important consequences for Chinese religion. Namely, there developed a consciousness of concern. It was the persistent belief that heaven had a vested interest in the well-being of people, which was tied to ethical conduct, and you'll see that very particularly in Confucianism. If people did the right things, like in ritual or in treating others well, then they would be shown favor from heaven. And then we have, the period of colonialism, particularly the second phase of colonialism, where Britain really takes a hold of a lot of mainland China, much like they had done in India, and that has an impact not only on the culture and historical projection of China, but also the ways in which the religion is understood, or even how what would come known as Confucianism and Taoism are understood on a Western model. So the scholars really look at, what are the beliefs of these individual religious traditions, disregarding the fact that people practicing these traditions may not have understood their own thing as a religion in the Western sense. And then we get the Chinese Communist Party gets brought to power in 1921. And it is technically an atheistic system, and in fact there's a great cultural purging in the 40s under Mao Zedong, which tries to purge what were thought of Western imperialist and colonialist ideologies, including and not limited to what were then understood as religions. Even Taoism, native Taoism, and Confucianism, they were purged from the state, and brutally so. There were priests and ministers, not just from Confucianism and Taoism, but from the Christian tradition, that were forced to leave the state or were even murdered. And in the 50s developed the cult of Mao, Here's a photo of Mao Zedong, and he was kind of the head of the Communist Party for a long time. And in the 50s developed kind of the cult of Mao, and a lot of scholars comment on after the Cultural Purge that tried to get rid of a lot of quote-unquote religions in mainland China. People still needed some form of religion, and so a lot of people devoted their lives to Mao, and a lot of systems and rituals and passions were developed, which mimicked in a lot of functional ways religion as we know of it. Okay, we've already talked about Tianming and the consciousness of concern, and just one more comment about China and its history with religion. It's important to note that Chinese popular religion is considered not completely separate from, but maybe if you think of a Venn diagram, its own circle that bleeds into Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism. But Chinese popular religion involves, animism, shamanism, and totemism, and was a part of very ancient dynasties even before the development of Confucianism and Taoism. So we have a lot of artifacts that attest to this. Like in shamanistic practices, we have a lot of burnt tortoise shells. Tortoise shells were used in dynastic courts as a way in which a shaman would try to understand Tianming, or the mandate of heaven. They would inscript secret writing onto the interior of these tortoise shells, these shamans, and then burn the tortoise shells. And where the tortoise shells would crack would indicate to the shaman what was the will of heaven. And again, shamanism is about that communication with the other world, with the divine, with the sacred. And that's what the shaman tried to do, was to understand the will of heaven so that they could inform the ruler of any given dynasty, whether it was the Qing or the Zhao dynasty. And that was a part of the Chinese tradition even before Taoism and Confucianism, and later even Buddhism. But that bleeds into kind of this Chinese popular religion, much like when we'll talk about modern religions. To this day, we have a lot more synchronistic religions that where they bleed into each other. So you could have a devout Christian in America who, also practices Reiki, and there's this kind of melding of different religious practices. So Confucianism, with Confucianism, we run into the same problem we've encountered before. Is this really a religion? It's a this worldly view. It's definitely a philosophy and an ethical and political theory. Beyond that, it's a little difficult to tell. Again, think about how you are starting to define religion. And there's no set answer in here. Again, we're going to be putting and keeping a pin on that definition of religion throughout this class. So whether or not Confucianism is quote-unquote officially a religion doesn't necessarily matter. People who practice it and people who study it consider it a religion, and so it is definitely worth our study, with a particular emphasis on the importance of the family and social harmony rather than on like an otherworldly soteriology. The core of Confucianism is known to be humanistic. Well, what does that mean? Humanism, in its philosophical and ethical sense, emphasizes the value of agency and human beings, individually and collectively, and generally prefers critical thinking and evidence over acceptance of dogma or superstition. That's how it's usually self-defined. Critics of humanistic thought, whether religious or not, because there's actually atheistic critiques of humanism as well, will usually portray certain dangers of humanism. That it relies too much on the thought that humans are good, right? And that you can rely on human reason. So there are criticisms of the humanistic tradition. So Confucianism is humanistic. It's also this-worldly. It's about the here and the now. The this-worldly concern of Confucianism rests on the belief that human beings are fundamentally good and teachable, that they're improvable, and that they're perfectible through personal and communal endeavor, especially self-cultivation and self-creation. Confucian thought focuses on the cultivation of virtue and maintenance of ethics. Now, Confucianism or Ruism is a more native term. Began in the 5th century BCE. It's still in that period that, according to Karl Jaspers, was the axial age. It's when not only Plato and Socrates are around and Zoroaster, but we have Confucius, we have Lao Tzu, Mencius, Sun Tzu, and some scholars even extend it to Jesus and all the way up into Abraham. So the reports are that he was born in 551 BCE. He was known as Kongqi or Kongni or Kongfusi. His Latinized or Romanized name is Confucius, where we get the term Confucianism. He died in 479 BCE. He was raised in the state, the Lu state, which is northeast China during the Zhou dynasty. This is a little this is a statue of what's purported to be Confucius. He's said to have worked in various government jobs during his 20s and also worked as a bookkeeper and caretaker of sheep and horses. After many years, Confucius worked his way up to become the minister of crime. He did this in a complicated feudal state within a part of ancient China that involved many political intrigues and machinations. Whenever I heard the term machinations, I think of Game of Thrones. Confucius, however, is said to have avoided corruption and maintained a moral compass throughout his rise to power. So, kind of like Jon Snow, with more of like intellectual backing. His ascent was not a Machiavellian one. Machiavelli, Renaissance writer from Italy, wrote The Prince, said you got to do whatever is necessary to get and maintain power. That's not what Confucius taught. So Confucius developed concepts about education, society, and government that he hoped to put into practice in a political career. But his loyalty to the king alienated him from the power holders of the time, which were the aristocratic families, much like the various families in Game of Thrones. And his moral rectitude did not sit well with the king's inner circle, who enraptured the king with sensuous delights. At 56, when he realized that his superiors were uninterested in his policies, particularly pertaining to the kind of philosophical system he was developing, Confucius left the country in an attempt to find another feudal state to which he could render his service. So despite his political frustration, he was accompanied by an expanding circle of students during his self-imposed exile of almost 12 years. His reputation as a man of vision and mission spread. At the age of 67, Confucius returned home to teach and to preserve his cherished and classical traditions by writing and editing. He died in 479 BCE at the age of 73. In the Analects, his life is summarized in this short manner. At 15, I set my heart at learning. At 30, I firmly took my stand. At 40, I had no delusions. I hope I get there. At 50, I knew the mandate of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I followed my heart's desire without overstepping the boundaries of right. It should be noted, and when we discussed religious founders, this should be kind of ringing in your ear, that the story of Confucianism does not really begin with Confucius, nor was Confucius the founder of Confucianism in the same way, perhaps, that the Buddha was the founder of Buddhism. Rather, Confucius considered himself a transmitter who consciously tried to retrieve the meaning of the past by breathing vitality into seemingly outmoded rituals. Confucius's love of antiquity was motivated by his strong desire to understand why certain rituals, such as the ancestral cult, reverence for heaven, and mourning ceremonies, had survived for centuries. He had faith in the cumulative power of culture. Confucius' sense of history was so strong that he saw himself as a conservationist of culture, and he was responsible for the continuity of cultural values and social norms that had worked so well for the civilizations of the Zhou dynasty. So he was a traditional, yes, and didn't conceive himself as starting something new, which is something we'll ask about when we get to the Abrahamic faiths, particularly in the case of Jesus and his early followers. Did they think that they were starting something new? Along with the caveat that Confucius wasn't really the founder of Confucianism per se, is the fact that there's also two other figures that are considered, the quote unquote founders of the tradition who had as big of an impact, if not even a bigger impact than Confucius himself, and those were Mencius and Sun Tzu. And these are two figures that sustained and expanded upon Confucianism after the death of Confucianism, which Confucianism was actually really not popular until the 2nd century BCE within China. Confucianism was then recognized as the Han state cult, introducing religious elements and sacrifice into Confucianism in the 5 classics, which are essential texts we'll discuss in a moment. So here we have a photo of Mencius and Sun Tzu. And again, they had a huge, important impact on Confucianism, mainly because they're the ones who scholars think are the ones who kind of really wrote and codified the essential texts of Confucianism, which we'll discuss in just a second. But first, in spite of the strong influence of Taoism and Buddhism, Confucian ethics have had the strongest influence on the moral fabric of Chinese society. A revival of Confucian thought in the 11th century produced Neo-Confucianism, a major influence in Korea during the Choson dynasty, and in Japan during the Tokugawa period. In 1530 CE, a Ming emperor reformed the Confucian cult to focus more on Confucius' teaching than on the sage himself. The cult of Confucius declined after the founding of the Chinese Republic, and certainly after the cultural purge of the Communist Chinese Party in the 1940s and 50s, but has had a upsurge more recently, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. So the essential text of Confucianism. There's more than just these 4, but these are the 4 main ones. These are ones that, for a long time, all students who wanted to study in China and become a part of the government had to master. So first there's the Analects, which is a collection of sayings and ideas attributed to the Chinese philosopher Confucius and his contemporaries, traditionally believed to have been written by them, but many scholars debate that now. It's believed to have been written during the Warring States period, which is 475 to 221 BCE, and achieved its final form some 100 years later in the mid-Han dynasty. By the early Han dynasty, the Analects were considered merely a commentator on the older Chinese classical texts, the 5 classics. But the status of the Analects grew to be one of the central texts of Confucianism by the end of the Han dynasty. During the late Song dynasty, the importance of the Analects as a philosophical work was raised above that of the older 5 classics. The Analects have been one of the most widely read and studied books in China for the last 2,000 years, and continues to have a substantial influence on Chinese and East Asian thought. So just some samplings from the Analects so you kind of get familiar with it. It's a lot about moral teaching and moral rectitude. So, quote, respect yourself and others will respect you. Hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. To be wealthy and honored in an unjust society is a disgrace. There's remnants of the Sermon on the Mount, the famous gospel sermons of Jesus. That you will think of when you read these. In fact, you'll find the same golden rule in its inverse form: treat others as you wish for them to treat you, in the Analects. The doctrine of the mean, that's the text is attributed to Kong Ji. It's the only known grandson of Confucius. And the doctrine of the mean represents moderation, rectitude, objectivity, sincerity, honesty, and propriety. It's all about trying to perfect oneself. The mean is also described as this kind of unwobbling pivot, and it means bent neither one way or another. The goal of the mean is to maintain balance and harmony from directing the mind to a state of constant equilibrium. The person who follows the mean is on a path of duty and must never leave it. A superior person is cautious, a gentle teacher, and shows no contempt for his or her inferiors. So a quote from the Doctrine of the Mean is: the superior man embodies the course of the mean man acts contrary to the course of the mean. The superior man does not wait till he sees things to be cautious, nor till he hears things to be apprehensive. There is nothing more visible than what is secret, and nothing more manifest than what is minute. There, the superior man is watchful over himself when he is alone. So the great learning developed from many authors adapting to the needs and beliefs of the community at the time. And the great learning was written much, much later in time. It's actually about 1,000 years after Confucius. Now, the ideas originally met with strong official opposition, but was widely adopted into the greater Confucian canon much later. One of the first steps to understanding the great learning is to understand how to, quote, investigate things. This did not consist of an scientific inquiry or experimentation, but introspection, building on what is already known. True introspection was supposed to allow the mind to become all-knowing with regard to morality, relationships, civic duty, and nature. And that's part of the kind of great learning. It's this aspect of introspection. And no one aspect of learning is isolated from the other, and failure to cultivate a single aspect of one's learning will lead to the failure of learning as a whole. And then lastly, although not like lastly in time or anything, but just how I numbered it, is the Mencius, named after Mencius, one of the quote-unquote founders of Confucianism. And it's a collection of anecdotes and conversations of this Confucian thinker and philosopher on topics in moral and political philosophy. And Mencius, in this text, records his travels and audiences with various rulers of the Warring States period. Mencius comprises 7 chapters, each divided into 2 halves, and it's not necessarily believed by many scholars today to have been directly penned by the historical figure of Mencius, but that his thoughts and ideas contributed immensely to its composition. All right, so the philosophical or ethical dimension within Confucianism, which some scholars or even some practitioners of the tradition will say is the entirety of the tradition. But within Confucianism, the doctrinal or philosophical dimension and the ethical or legal dimension are very intimately connected. This is because Confucianism takes a humanistic, this-worldly perspective. For comparison's sake, we could see that in Buddhism, ethics derive from Buddhist philosophy, specifically concerning the nature of reality. For Confucianism, however, ethics and philosophy are almost one in the same. They are coterminous, being in the same extent, coextensive in range or scope. So ethics is first philosophy in Confucianism. And in the West, we also have a philosophical example of this in a philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, stated that true philosophy is not actually love of wisdom, like the term philosophy means, but the wisdom of love. He imagined that ethics as first philosophy meant the ethics of the other, my responsibility to the other, whomever or whatever that may be, precedes any objective searching after truth. So before I even start speculating on what it means to be, Everything needs to be grounded on my ethical relationship to the other. Now, this isn't necessarily what Confucius taught, but it's kind of in the same vein that ethics is the first philosophy. So Confucianism revolves around the pursuit of the unity of the self and Tian, or heaven, and the relationship of humankind to heaven, but in a very humanistic vein. And this unity is most acutely developed through ethics. And that's the humanism, because it's an ethical relationship to another human being and to other humans. Slightly different, or maybe vastly different, than the kind of Western Abrahamic tradition, when a lot of the ethics is derived from first the relationship to a god. This ethics is derived from a relationship to humans. Morality is understanding the distinction between right and wrong and a living according to that understanding, and ethics is the philosophy of how that morality guides individual and group behavior. The two are closely related, with morality being the foundation of ethics. In terms of the tradition of Confucianism, I don't think this distinction is entirely evident, and so I'll use the terms more than morals or morality as a matter of convenience. Confucian ethics are described as humanistic because they are supposed to derive from human reason and experience rather than divine commands or from tradition. So Confucian ethics is characterized by the promotion of virtues known as the Five Constants, or the Wu Chang, not the Wu-Tang Clan. And these were really extrapolated during the Han Dynasty. And they are Ren, Yi, Li, Ji, Zhen. And that's humaneness or benevolence, righteousness or justice, proper right or ritual, knowledge, and integrity. So Ren is the Confucian virtue denoting the good feeling of virtuous human experience when being altruistic. Yi represents moral acumen, which goes beyond just like simple rule following. Li will elaborate a little bit more in just the next slide, but it's just all about ritual, decorum, rules, and propriety, good form, good custom. Oftentimes also thought of as natural law. It really means a lot more than what we're just thinking of when we think of ritual. Ji means knowledge, but by knowledge they mean much more than just kind of book learning. It includes kind of experiential knowledge, introspective knowledge, and then integrity. Think of construction of a house, the integrity of a house, being able to withstand the storms, and that's kind of a metaphor that is used oftentimes within Confucianism. Ritual, in the ritual dimension. Like I said, we'll come back to Li, because Li is one of the Five Constants, and it's sometimes often thought of as the most important contribution that Confucius himself gave to what would become the Confucian tradition. So Confucius taught that the practice of altruism he thought necessary for social cohesion could be mastered only by those who have learned self-discipline. So learning self-restraint and self-discipline involves studying and mastering Li, the ritual forms and rules of propriety through which one expresses respect for superiors and enacts his role in society in such a way that he himself is worthy of respect and admiration. So we have to think of Li in its Confucian context. Confucius' goal here is social cohesion, development, ethics as first philosophy. We're trying to establish an ethical relationship with other humans based upon human reason, and he thinks that is accomplished through ritual, because what ritual does is it is an enactment of a kind of a, let's say, cosmic understanding of our relationships to each other, and it helps us practice and inhabit forms of self-restraint and self-discipline that aid in social cohesion. So it's really about maintaining in-groups and out-groups, and this obviously is tied with religion, as we want to understand it in its wider sense, not just in its Western sense of privately held belief, because that's what religions have done in their histories is maintain these in-groups and out-groups and restore cohesion. So subjecting oneself to ritual does not, however, mean suppressing one's desires, but instead learning how to reconcile one's desires with the needs of one's family and community. Confucius and many of his followers teach that it is by experiencing desires that we learn the value of social strictures that make an ordered society possible. Confucius' emphasis on ritual does not mean that he was a punctilious or ceremonialist who thought that the rites of worship and of social exchange had to be practiced correctly at all costs. Confucius taught, on the contrary, that if one did not possess a keen sense of the well-being and interests of others, his ceremonial manner signified nothing. Equally important was Confucius' insistence that the rites not be regarded as mere forms, but they be practiced with complete devotion and sincerity, hence Ren. And some scholars will question, particularly if they are thinking exclusively in a Western paradigm of what a religion is this type of ritual really ritual? Is it really religious ritual? Because it's not devotional worship. But again, we need to really put into question what we mean by first religion and then also ritual, because we can even think of secular or atheistic rituals that should still count and be analyzed as rituals. And here's an example of Confucius ritual. Alright, yeah, I'm just going to play it.
Hi everyone, this is Kiyoshi from Taipei, Taiwan. Now I'm standing at the entrance of Taipei Confucius Temple. This is one of the most popular sites for tourists to visit. Let's go inside. Taipei Kong Miao. The Taipei Confucius Temple was begun in 1879 and re-erected on Dalong Street in 1939. The design of the temple is an example for typical Fujian temple style. This is the main building of Taipei Confucius Temple, called Dacheng Dian. September 28th is 教师节, means Teacher's Day, which is celebrated to commemorate the birth of Confucius, the ultimate sage. On this day, Taipei Confucius Temple would hold a grand and solemn ceremony dedicated to Confucius. Shidian Dianli 开始 means the ceremony begins. All these musicians, dancers, and deacons advance to the beats of the drum, with making 5 steps and 1 stop in between beats. Pei Ji Guan, 就位 means the assistant sacrifice officers take their designated positions. Ying Shen means welcome spirit. This is to reverentially welcome the descent of Confucian spirit. They hold Ti Den, lanterns, San, umbrella, and Shan, sunshade. 万世师表 on the sunshade means Confucius is the model teacher of ages. Xing Chu Xian Li means initial principle presentation. The ceremony is highlighted by a traditional 八佾舞, means 8 square formation dance, to pay tribute to the Confucian ideologies of teaching without social class discrimination and teaching students in accordance with their aptitude. The Yongzhong is a large bell set to the east side. The Jinggu is a large drum set to the west side. The arrangement represents matin bells and vesper drums. The shen is consisting of 13 bamboo pipes inserted in a metal chamber with finger holes. They dance with the ritual objects, di, pheasant tail feather, and yue, ancient short flute. According to the Chinese ancient customs, the pheasant tail feather is the most beautiful thing. Therefore, it is taken for showing the highest respect to Confucius. Teachers' Day is also a day to honor our teachers and acknowledge their hard work over the past years. After visiting the
Okay, so you can kind of notice in the kind of choreographed ritual steps, the pacing, the procedures which they follow, that it is fairly structured affair. And there's reasons behind that tied with kind of Confucius thought. Again, Confucius thought on Li or on ritual is that you don't just do it just to do it, but you do it to learn self-restraint. And you do it, you can tell in the difference shown from the younger practitioners to the older practitioners. You're learning how to develop an ethical relationship with what in Confucius thought is your superior, who is your elder. And typically like who is your father, who is your leader, sort of thing. So the social and institutional dimension of Confucianism. Now, again, Confucius attempted to make ethics as first philosophy. To complicate matters, he also conceived politics as first philosophy because ethics necessarily entails politics and vice versa. His political philosophy has a direct bearing on the social and institutional dimension of Confucianism. Confucius wanted to figure out how best to structure a society. One of the major currents of thought that he struggled with in his time was known as legalism. Legalism advocated a highly authoritarian government based on draconian punishments and laws. In this perspective, Li would be emphasized as a means of social control. For example, peasants would be instructed to perform rituals as a means of instilling and demonstrating obedience. Confucius would say it differently. Individuals want to perform rituals out of ren, out of their own desires. So he wanted to design a structure of society that didn't really use force or coercion to get everyone to behave ethically. Of course, you need to ask, what is coercion? What constitutes coercion? So for Confucius, this was a top-down affair. It begins with the ruler. Confucius' political philosophy is rooted in his belief that a ruler should learn self-discipline, should govern his subjects by his own example, and should treat them with love and concern. Quote, if the people be led by laws and uniformity among them be sought by punishments, they will try to escape punishment and have no sense of shame. But if they are led by virtue and uniformity sought among them through the practice of ritual propriety, they will possess a sense of shame and come to you of their own accord. Most troubling to Confucius was his perception that the political institutions of his day had completely broken down. He attributed this collapse to the fact that those who wielded power, as well as those who occupied subordinate positions, did so by making claim to titles for which they were not worthy. When asked by a ruler of the large state of Qi, Lu's neighbor on the Shandong Peninsula, about the principles of good government, Confucius is reported to have replied, quote, good government consists in the ruler being a ruler, the minister being a minister, the father being a father, and the son being a son. So for Confucius, the names of positions actually mean quite a big make a big deal. So they develop within Confucianism the idea of Jingming, the rectification of names, the correcting of names. Quote, I should claim for myself only a title that is legitimately mine, and when I possess such a title and participate in the various hierarchical relationships signified by that title, I should live up to the meaning of the title that I claim for myself. Confucius' analysis of the lack of connection between actualities and their names and the need to correct such circumstances is referred to Jingming. So it's all about trying to analyze the names of things, whether father, ruler, son, and correct their meaning for people to follow. Also within the social and institutional dimension of Confucianism is the notion of meritocracy. Now, meritocracy is something that we promote in the West as well. It's people get what they deserve based on merit rather than right of birth. Like you were born into a good family, you should automatically go to a good college or whatever. So although Confucius claimed that he never invented anything but was only transmitting ancient knowledge, he did produce a number of new ideas. Many European and American admirers point to the revolutionary idea of replacing nobility of blood with nobility of virtue, which originally signified the younger, non-inheriting offspring of a noble, it became in Confucius' work an epithet having much the same meaning and evolution as the English gentleman. So meritocracy, or the notion of meritocracy, led to the introduction of the imperial examination system in China. This system allowed anyone who passed an examination to become a government officer, a position which would bring wealth and honor to the whole family. Over the following centuries, the system grew until finally almost anyone who wished to become an official had to prove his worth by passing written government examinations. The practice of meritocracy still exists today in Chinese cultural sphere, including China, Taiwan, Singapore, and so forth. It should be said, though, that in many ways the meritocratic system or ideology as it is in China, as well as it is in the West, is great and ideal, but in actuality, a lot of times it doesn't live up to that ideal, as the recent college examination scandals in America demonstrate. So there's also a current promotion of Confucianism within the Chinese Communist Party, and a lot of commentators think that that's because it's the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Xi Jinping, which are attempting to co-opt Confucianism to control the populace. So we'll watch this video real quickly.
We've really had an opportunity to find great talent in the city and continue to grow our business and fuel it with resources that we find.
Here, I could mute it and talk more. Probably a good time to say I'm sorry that my voice is probably still annoying you. Hopefully that will end.
This is a traditional style wedding held inside the Confucius Academy in China's southwestern city of Guiyang. Following the rituals of the Han Dynasty, which ended 1800 years ago, the couple tie together strands of their hair, wash each other's hands, and take a sip of bitter wine. Finally, they kneel and bow their heads to a statue of Confucius.
我们每一个仪式的环节，我们都会向友人，还有来这里的亲朋好友，以及在这里的市民，我们都会告诉他每一个环节是做什么的。这一个礼它的寓意是什么？它也有一个就是传播的作用吧。希望大家都知道我们的传统婚礼，知道我们的传统文化。
This and other activities at the government-supported Confucius Academy are among the clearest illustrations of how China is trying to revive traditional culture, especially Confucianism, as a source of political legitimacy. Confucius emphasized respect for elders, social ritual, and personal moral virtue. His ideas dominated China for 2 millennia, but were attacked as backward and feudal when the Communist Party took power. Now the party is returning to many Confucian ideas, while clamping down on Western influence in academia, art, religion, and civil society. The Academy was built by local developers at a cost of $185 million and opened in 2013. A 30-foot tall Confucius statue towers over visitors as they climb a long staircase leading to the entrance of the 75-acre complex. Now managed and funded by the local government, the Academy also provides coming-of-age rituals for children, facilities for Confucian scholars to live and work, and free lectures on Confucian philosophy to the public.
里边呢，我们正在进行的就是叫公益性的文化讲座。中国是一个礼仪之邦，是特别强调道德治理、道德治人这么一个国家。那么这些年来，越来越重视对传统文化的弘扬。那么建立孔学堂就是这样一个目的。
Few Chinese people still believe in communism. And as the economy slows, the party can no longer rely on the promise of rapid wealth creation to keep it in power. China's leaders hope places like this will provide a new sense of cultural identity and a reason to reject Western political ideals, while encouraging Chinese officials to be less corrupt.
改革开放30多年了，那么我们的经济社会取得了很大的发展，但是在精神方面，我就说在道德方面，这么多年以来，各种各样的原因是有问题的，我们是有不少的问题。
Last year, local authorities opened a traditional culture training center for local officials, the first of its kind in China. Provincial and city bureaucrats have been attending regular training courses here ever since.
如果中国人站在世界上，除了他经济上好、科技上发达以外，精神上、道德上也要好。我们要成为一个真正的文明人。
All right, so that video really brings up in interesting ways the relationship between religion and state power. Kind of topic we'll come back to throughout the course. And when talking about religion and state power, there's some ways to kind of frame this debate. We need to think of different ways in which religion could be related to state power, as in the difference between theocracy and Caesaropapism. Now, theocracy is when a religious elite control the government or control the state, which is in opposition to Caesaropapism, when a secular state controls the church or controls the religion. Now, there's a lot of gray areas in between that, and those two options are oftentimes put in distinction to a liberal democracy, which is supposed to have, quote-unquote, a separation between church and state. However, oftentimes you can think of, even in a liberal democracy, something like a doxocracy to kind of be the order of the day. And that's sort of a neologism. You won't really find that on Google, a doxocracy. But doxocracy comes from doxology, belief, or creeds. And it really goes to the heart of that. When a religion becomes such the identity and ideology of a state that it in effect rules a quote-unquote secular state. So if a state has in its founding documents or in its kind of self-promoted ideals that it is secular, that there's a separation between church and state, but there are ways in which certain religious beliefs, and because religion is defined in its modern aspect of privately held beliefs, become the order of the day, become kind of the universal idiom of both ideology and identity for everyone living in that state. So there's ways of kind of phrasing religion, the relationship between religion and state power. And in the West, we've really pushed this idea of liberalism, derived even before Locke, but really in this Lockean sense where you have the freedom to think for oneself, liberty of consciousness, liberty of choice of religion. even though for Locke it was kind of which choice of Christianity, not really which choice of like atheism or non-theism or whatever. Anyways, so in this kind of Western tradition, we have the notions of secularism, and in another course later on in class, we'll really dig into what that really means. But the typical definition, which one that we will argue against later, the typical definition of secularism is known as a subtraction theory, that secularism is just society minus religion. It's like a simple equation. That's kind of the standard definition, known as the subtraction theory. And again, when we come to the class right after the midterm, we will contest that understanding of secularism, because it leads to a lot of problems, not just for people who argue against religion, but actually religious people themselves. Disestablishmentarianism built into, you can think of American constitutional law, built into American constitutional law, that there is no established church of the state, that the state doesn't favor any one church, doesn't patronize any one church, doesn't give it money. That's obviously complicated in a lot of modern examples, with that they're given tax breaks and certain kind of tax benefits as well. But that's the general rule. And then there's religious liberty and religious pluralism. They're related, but they're slightly different. So like liberty, like I was talking about in the Lockean sense, John Locke, that you have the right, the freedom of conscience to kind of choose what you want to believe. And again, that's a very modern understanding of what it means to be religious, because you have the right to choose your own private belief. As long as it's your own private belief, then nobody can touch you. And again, that's the kind of modern definition that's derived from Luther's focus on sola fide and sola scriptura, and that gets exported to the wider world through colonialism. Secular states, and religious pluralism. That's it's the marketplace of ideology. Now, every religion is competing with every other religion on this pluralistic sphere. So that those are kind of four aspects within the Western kind of ideal of separation of church and state. Secular states often use religious ideologies, like we saw in that video with Confucianism. This is also the case in the West, however. We might not like to think of it in that way. But religions often use secular state power, and there's a long history of that. The entire relationship between the high medieval Catholic Church and the various kingdoms of Europe attest to that. But even in subtle ways, particularly like I alluded to before, in terms of tax benefits for individual churches and stuff. All this brings to the question, really, how does one ground or justify ultimate authority? Because you can defend either position, whether it's theocracy, Caesaropapism, or liberal democracy, depending upon how you justify or ground ultimate authority. Think of, again, like the pyramid, the foundation. How do you ground or justify the whole support structure of your system? Well, if you think ultimate authority is God, particularly your God, the God that you have known through revelation or some sacred text or some experience, well, then you're more amenable to a theocratic or a theocratic style of government. Most certainly you support maybe not on a knowledgeable level, a doxocratic form of society as well. But if you think that the ultimate authority, the ultimate foundational principle is reason or what have you, enlightenment thought, then you're more amenable to a liberal democratic society. The trick of this is how you justify that justification, how you give authority to that authority is a circular argument. So if I claim that God is my ultimate authority, I base that simply upon God. Okay, well, obviously a circular argument. If I say that reason is my ultimate authority, well, I'm basing that on reason. Oh, that's another circular argument. So you see the difficulty in this debate, and it's why it still kind of plagues Western liberal democracies in our attempts to formulate and ground, what we want to do in our society. Which is not to say that it should be done away with. It's just to say that it's something we all need to think about. All right, the mythic dimension within Confucianism. We're just going to kind of briefly go through this. It's hard to tease out really any religious myths about Confucius. There's some stuff about that gets oftentimes added later with some origin myths about how he grew up. It involves some dragons guarding his mother when he was born. But by and large, a lot of scholars think that these myths were added at a later date and time, which is not to discredit them. Oftentimes, scholars think that these myths are added to Confucianism when it starts blending with Chinese popular religion, again, shamanism, Taoism, animism, and also with Taoism, and so it incorporates more myths. A lot of scholars think that Confucius himself was not considered as, or how he viewed the divine. It's not oftentimes thought of as a completely atheistic system, since he references and talks about Tian or heaven often, and about unification with Tian. But people suspect, or scholars suspect, that if it's not atheistic, it's at least deistic in the sense that you don't need to reference God. But then there's also the issue as Confucius as divine. Was he thought of as a divine-like figure? Well, it depends on who you ask. Confucius scholars and philosophers would say no, but lay practitioners throughout history have often venerated as Confucius as divine. And it should be noted, just because you bow to a statue of a religious figure, whether it's the Buddha or whether it's Confucius, does not necessarily mean that that practitioner, that insider to the tradition, views their statue in the same way that someone in the Abrahamic tradition would view what they're bowing to. It is obviously a gesture of reverence. It is obviously a gesture of concentration and devotion to that figure. But understanding the complexity and nuances of different human experience should give us pause to say they're the same exact thing. That being said, it is oftentimes the case that Confucius was thought of divine in the long cultural tradition of Confucius. And here kind of gives us an example of a Confucius temple where you see some of that kind of breathed into architectural form.
The Confucius Temple is a peaceful alternative to the other more crowded temples of Beijing, and as you enter through the richly decorated archway, or Pilao, which is one of the last in the city, you step into a gentle place of calm. The main body of the temple was started in 1302, and is built around two courtyards, which are divided by the Dacheng Gate. Dacheng means great achievement, and the gate commemorates Confucius's fine contribution to Chinese culture. The elegant bell that hangs on one side was rung 108 times when an emperor came to worship at the temple. And the drum on the right was beaten 360 times. There is a statue of Confucius at the main entrance of the temple. Confucius was a scholar born in 552 BC, and as a reaction to the war and troubles surrounding him, he taught a strict code of moral and social values based on hierarchy and obedience. Although not overly well known in his lifetime, Confucius became hugely popular 600 years later during the Han Dynasty, when his teachings became the state religion. For thousands of years during the Yuan, Ming, and Ying dynasties, the names of scholars who passed the imperial examination based on Confucius's teachings, and so they could then become members of state, would be inscribed on these stone tablets here in the temple. These 198 stone tablets still stand and record the names, place of birth, and rank of over 50,000 graduates dating back as far as 1313, and so provide amazing insight into the culture and politics of the temple over the past 1,000 years. Walking through the arch, you come to the main courtyard. This is a beautiful harmony of tree and temple. There are 106 ancient cypress trees, some over 700 years old, and dotted amongst them 11 small pavilions that house stone tablets which rest on pedestals carved in the shape of a tortoise. In the summer, these trees become completely alive with birds, and in the winter, over 100 owls have been seen in this courtyard. One particular tree is the evil differentiating cypress, because in the Wang dynasty, a sweet dew was found on its leaves, which is said to be an omen. And also in the Ming dynasty, its branches pluck the cap of a treacherous prime minister. The main temple, or Dacheng Hall, was rebuilt in 1906 and houses a memorial tablet to Confucius. Also, some sacrificial vessels, musical instruments, and some wonderful carved oxen and pigs that represent the animals that would have been sacrificed to Confucius.
So you can see that Confucius was, in many points in history and for many participants in the Confucian tradition, seen as divine. There were animals sacrificed to him, which is not to say that that's how all Confucianism has been in its history or how it is today, because much like all the other religious traditions that we have talked about and will discuss, there is a really large diversity and complexity to this very awesome tradition. Okay, so the next thing is we're going to talk about Taoism within Chinese religion. And yes, it can be spelled either way. These are romanizations, but both spellings are correct, but it's pronounced Dao, not Tao. Taoism. Like Confucianism, Taoism doesn't really begin with its purported founder, Lao Tzu. There has been a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about Taoism in the West, and that has greatly impacted the way in which we view its history and the tradition itself. The well-regarded German sinologist Anna Seidel said it best, quote, it's kind of a long quote, so please bear with me. Trying to explain the range of meanings of the term Taoism to a Western public would be similar to an attempt by a Chinese lecturer to elucidate to his Asian audience the elements of European culture, taking them from Greek philosophy, Christianity, the medieval church, the Vatican, to Protestant sectarian revivalism, and the Bavarian pilgrimage churches. The Asian audience of this speaker might be tempted to consider Plato and Aristotle as founders of Christianity, an idea which is about as wrong as the view that Lao Tzu is the founder of Taoism. If we add the possibility that the same Asian public had learned from scholarly books that the New Testament, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and the Church Fathers were merely a degenerate form of the high philosophy of antiquity that had sunk to the level of primitive folk belief and a backward and foolish form of nonsense, then we would have an analogy to what Confucian scholars of the modern period, certain missionaries, and many sinologists have said about the Taoist religion. What's really interesting about that quote is that her critique of the way in which the history of Taoism is usually portrayed is exactly how Enlightenment thinkers thought of the history of the West. They thought that Christianity was this degeneration from classical Greek and Roman thought, and then we get into the Dark Ages. Interesting, something we'll talk about later in the class after the midterm. So this misunderstanding of Taoism in the West really began in the 16th, 17th centuries when Christian missionaries drew a stark contrast between Chinese religion and philosophy. Again, start to think about, in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries when figures like Kant come on and start putting a wedge between philosophy and religion. Taoism was then interpreted as a philosophical tradition that was begun by Lao Tzu sometime in the 4th or 5th century BCE and then was corrupted, quote-unquote corrupted, by a series of infusions by Chinese popular religion. The truth of the matter, however, is much more complicated, of course. It's been said that, quote, Taoism has never been a unified religion and has constantly consisted of a combination of teachings based on a variety of original revelations. So Taoism is both at once philosophy and religion, and to attempt to pigeonhole the Tao tradition into a false categorization would do it really a disservice. So just some brief history. So Lao Tzu, although we say he's not the founder, he's oftentimes seen as traditionally regarded as the founder. And whether he actually existed is disputed. However, the work attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, is dated to the late 4th century BCE. The earliest certain reference to the present figure of Lao Tzu is found in the 1st century BCE records of the grand historian Sima Qian. In one account, Lao Tzu was said to be a contemporary of Confucius, but that would have been in the 6th and 5th century. One of the traditional sources of Lao Tzu states that he grew weary of the moral decay of life in China. He ventured west to live as a hermit in the unsettled frontier at the age of 80. At the western gate of a city or of a kingdom, it's kind of unclear, he was recognized by a guard, and so the guard asked the old master to record his wisdom for the good of the country before he would be permitted to pass. The text that Lao Tzu wrote was said to be the Tao Te Ching, although the present version of the text includes additions from later periods, according to most scholars. In some versions of the tale, the guard was so touched by the work that he became a disciple and left with Lao Tzu, never to be seen from again. So from here, Taoism begins to develop into this kind of amorphous cluster of religious ideas, and it's really only by the Han Dynasty that the various sources of Taoism coalesced into a coherent tradition, and that's in like the 3rd century CE. So maybe, depending on when you date him, 700 years, 600 years, 500 years after Lao Tzu. In earlier ancient China, Taoists were thought of as hermits or recluses who did not participate in political life, and there's reason behind that, which we'll discuss in a minute. Some elements of Taoism may be traced to prehistoric folk religions in China that later coalesced into a Taoist tradition. In particular, many Taoist practices drew from the shamanic culture of ancient China. Early Taoist movements developed their own institution in contrast to shamanism, but absorbed basic shamanic elements. It's kind of like that how Hinduism developed and incorporated a lot of the shamanic or ascetic practices of Buddhism, and thus kind of took over Buddhism, and then Buddhism kind of declines in the Indian subcontinent. It's similar in ways to that. You see a decline in popular Chinese religion. Throughout its long history, Taoism has evolved into numerous schools. Each school has claimed some revelation from Lao Tzu or some enlightened insight into the Tao. And we'll come back to the different schools later when we get into the dimensions. Today, Taoism is one of 5 religions recognized by the People's Republic of China. The government regulates its activities through the Chinese Taoist Association. Taoism also has sizable communities in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of scholarly work on the interaction between Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And many scholars believe Taoism arose as a counter-movement to Confucianism. The philosophical terms Tao and De are indeed shared with both Taoism and Confucianism, and Lao Tzu is traditionally held to have been a teacher of Confucius, although a lot of scholars really doubt that. Zhuangzi explicitly criticized Confucius and Mohi's tenets in his work. In general, Taoism rejects the Confucius emphasis on rituals, hierarchical social order, and conventional morality, and favors naturalness, spontaneity, and individualism instead. With Buddhism, the entry of Buddhism into China was marked by significant interaction and even syncretism with Taoism. Remember from the last class that famous portrait of the adult Confucius passing over the baby Buddha to the adult Lao Tzu. Originally seen as a kind of foreign Taoism, Buddhism scriptures were translated into Chinese using the Taoist vocabulary. Taoism especially shaped the development of Chan, and then later Zen Buddhism, introducing elements like the concept of naturalness, distrust of scripture and text, and emphasis on embracing this life and living in every moment. Taoism, on the other hand, also incorporated Buddhist elements during the Tang period, such as monasteries, vegetarianism, prohibition of alcohol, and the doctrine of emptiness. The essential texts, we have primarily 3. There are, of course, like all other traditions, more, but we'll focus on 3. We have the Tao Te Ching, which is widely considered the most influential Taoist text. According to legend, it was written by Lao Tzu, but of course, scholars doubt that. The earliest extant texts of the Tao Te Ching date back to the 4th century, and they're written on bamboo tablets. The leading themes revolve around the nature of the Tao and how to attain it. Tao is said to be ineffable and accomplishing great things through small means. We'll go over the Tao a little bit more. It's a short text, around 5,000 Chinese characters in 81 brief chapters or sections. The ideas are singular and the style is kind of poetic. Next we have the I Ching. It was originally a divination system that had its origins, it's said to have had its origins in 1150 BCE. So although it predates the first mentions of Tao as an organized system of philosophy and religious practice, this ancient Chinese classic has long been adopted as a meditative text by people. The well-practiced amongst them later became known as Taoist, which explains the tangled relationship many Chinese folk religions and what is later known officially as Taoism. While some commentators see the I Ching as no more than a classic augury or text for divination purpose, the I Ching is used in Taoist practice has never been just like a simple revelatory text. Instead of requiring mindless obedience to its edicts, as was the case amongst Greek oracles, the I Ching demanded rigorous internal meditation of its Taoist practitioners. The I Ching, in contrast to other religious texts, is said to be interpreted by its readers. Confucius has famous commentaries on the meanings of the hexagrams being from the I Ching. Now we'll go and we'll watch a video a little bit later about using the I Ching itself. And then lastly, we have the Zhuangzi. It's an ancient Chinese text written in the late Warring States period, which contains stories and anecdotes that exemplify the carefree nature of the Taoist sage. The Zhuangzi is named for and attributed to Zhuangzhou, or Master Zhuang. Since ancient times, however, the first 7 chapters have been considered to be the actual work of Zhuangzi, and the remaining have been kind of fabrications. From this text, we have the famous butterfly dream, which you can see in this video here.
And now we must speak of Zhuangzhu, who fell asleep one day and dreamed he was a butterfly. For hours he fluttered in the warm winter sun, until he no longer remembered he was Zhuangzhu. Suddenly he awoke, and he was Zhuangzhu again. But in that moment he didn't know, was he Zhuangzhu who had dreamt he was a butterfly? Or a butterfly who was dreaming he was Zhuangzhu?
That is really short, and it's basically the entire parable, the entire story that you find in the Zhuangzi book about Zhuangzhou's dream, and we'll elaborate a little bit on what this kind of means, but it's really trying to understand the essence of being and what it means to be, and how it's essentially tied to naturalness, about understanding what it is to be in your most natural state. So in the philosophical dimension, of course, we have the Tao, and it's the central concept that unites all the diversity that gets lumped together into Taoism. It literally means the way, but can also be interpreted as road, channel, path, doctrine, or line. Sometimes it's thought of as like the river. In Taoism, it is, quote, the one which is natural, spontaneous, eternal, nameless, and indescribable. It is at once the beginning of all things and the way in which all things pursue their course. Lao Tzu explains that the Tao is not a name for a thing, but the underlying natural order of the universe, whose ultimate essence is difficult to kind of describe due to its just non-conceptual, but yet it's evident to everyone. The Tao is known as the eternally nameless, and it's distinguished between the countless named things. There's no single orthodox Taoist view of the Tao, which may be frustrating for you. All forms of Taoism, however, do center around the Tao, but there is a broad variety of distinct interpretations among sects and even individuals within the same sect. Despite this diversity, there are some clear common patterns and trends within Taoism and its branches. The Tao is oftentimes viewed more theistically, or probably more correctly pantheistically. Within these Taoist traditions, the Tao is ever present, but must be manifested, cultivated, or perfected in order to be realized. It is the source of the universe and is the seed of its primordial purity, which resides in all things. Alternatively, the Tao is sometimes regarded as a non-religious or non-theistic concept. It's not a deity to be worshipped, nor is it a mystical absolute in kind of the religious sense of the Hindu Brahma. In contrast to the esotericism typically found in religious systems, the Tao is not transcendent to the self, nor is it mystical attainment or attainment from the world in philosophical Taoism. The self is steeped in the Tao, and the self that is steeped in the Tao is the self grounded in its place within the natural universe. A person dwelling within the Tao excels in themselves and their activities. Related to the Tao is the notion of De, which is translated as virtue, excellent, moral power. In the inner moral power through which a person may positively influence others. Although the term is often translated in English as virtue, De is not simply a desirable human trait or quality such as goodness. It's actually something that humans naturally flow towards. The concept of De played an important role in civic rights in Imperial China. And again, though, it's not that you have to force yourself to be good, but this is actually supposed to be your natural state of integrity, of virtue, and of power. And then, probably most importantly, is the concept of Ziran. And it's probably helpful to use this as an example. This is a famous a painter of the vinegar tasters. And it's... the allegorical composition depicts the three founders of China's major religious and philosophical traditions: Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. The theme in the painting has been interpreted as favoring Taoism and critical of the others. The three men are dipping their fingers in a vat of vinegar and tasting it. One man reacts with a sour expression, one reacts with a bitter expression, and one reacts with a sweet expression. The three men are Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu, respectively. Each man's expression represents the predominant attitude of his philosophy. Confucianism saw life as sour, in need of rules to correct the degeneration of people. Buddhism saw life as bitter, dominated by pain and suffering, hence you need to escape from it. And Taoism saw life as fundamentally good in its natural state, like vinegar. And so this is the notion, the Taoist notion of Shiran, of naturalness, of trying to get back to the state of nature. So from the Taoist point of view, sourness and bitterness come from the interfering, unappreciative mind. Life itself, when understood and utilized for what it is sweet. And that's kind of the message of the vinegar tasters. It's important is this notion of or this metaphor of pu, of unworked wood. That's the metaphor, the guiding metaphor for Taoism's push for Shiran. Is you want to get to this notion that unworked wood is just wood that you find in the forest, whether it's growing on a tree or it's just a stump in the wood. It hasn't been shaved. It hasn't been turned into a log for construction or whatnot. It is completely perfect in its naturalness, and that's the state by which Taoists want to achieve to. And I'm not the first one to know this because there's the famous book, The Tao of Pu, but the metaphor of Pu, works very well phonically. So here's an example of Winnie the Pooh.
In the summer of 2018, 86% of Oregon was...
Another commercial, sorry. Yes, so think of getting to just your complete natural state, like what that would look like.
Deep in the 100-acre wood, Winnie the Pooh has had many wonderful adventures. Here's one of them right now. Spring had arrived, and this was a day that Pooh had been looking forward to for some time now. So as the sun rose, he was already awake and had a particularly bouncy bounce to his step. Pooh! Wake up! Pooh!
Mother, I was having the most wonderful dream.
I'm sure, but it's time to wake up. Remember, you have a very important thing to do today.
Like what?
I'm sure it will come to you.
Oh, of course. What could be more important than a little something to eat? Or perhaps a little large or something? Oh, not to worry, Tommy. I always know what to do. A Pooh Bear takes care of his tummy. He fills it with things that are sweet. A Pooh Bear takes care of his tummy by never forgetting to eat. When it is growly and glummy, the search for the honey is on. The Pooh has a knack for finding a snack unless all the honey is gone.
So, it's just Pooh being Pooh. He's literally embodying the metaphor of Puh, of unworked wood. He's just responding to the most natural thing about him is trying to feed himself. And that, is highlighted in a book written by Benjamin Hoff called The Tao of Pooh, which kind of introduces to the Western audiences a lot of these essential Taoist ideas, but it really brings to light this notion of Shiran, of attempting to return to a state of naturalness. And it's really tied to the ethics in Taoism, with this notion of Wu Wei. Wei refers to any intentional or deliberate action, while Wu carries the meaning of there is no or lacking. So the meaning is sometimes emphasized by using the paradoxical expression Wu Wei Wu, action without action. In ancient Taoist texts, Wu Wei is associated with water running through its yielding nature. In Taoist philosophy, in accordance with the I Ching, proposes that the universe works harmoniously according to its own ways. When someone exerts their will against the world in a manner that is out of rhythm with the cycles of nature, they may disrupt the harmony, and unintended consequences may more likely result than the willed outcome. So by Wu Wei, the sage seeks to come into harmony with the great Tao, which itself accomplishes by non-action. And, related to this notion of action without action, that you're actually, when you return to a state of Shiran, you're at your complete, most natural thing, in tuned with nature. You're not actually acting. It's not a dissolution of the will, of agency, but it is a realization of agency within its most natural form. Related to that is the notion of the Sun Bao, or the three treasures, the Shi Zhen and Bung Wei Jiaxin Jin. I don't speak Chinese, so I apologize if I mispronounce that. But these are all ethical dimensions related to this action without action, and these are all done not in a willful manner in the way in which we understand it, but in the realization of our most natural self, as exemplified in these videos.
Master! I have... It's very bad news. Shifu. There is just news. There is no good or bad. Master, your vision was right. Tai Lung has broken out of prison. He's on his way. That is bad news. If you do not believe that the Dragon Warrior can stop him.
The panda? Master, that panda is not the Dragon Warrior. He wasn't even meant to be here. It was an accident.
There are no accidents.
Yes, I know. You've said that already. Twice.
Well, that was no accident either.
Thrice.
My old friend, the panda will never fulfill his destiny, nor you yours, until you let go of the illusion of control.
Illusion?
Yes. Look at this tree, Sifu. I cannot make it blossom when it suits me, nor make it bear fruit before its time.
But there are things we can't control. I can control when the fruit will fall. And I can control where to plant the seed. That is no illusion, Master.
Ah, yes. But no matter what you do, that seed will grow to be a peach tree. You may wish for an apple or an orange, but you will get a peach.
But a peach cannot defeat Tai Lung.
Maybe it can, if you are willing to guide it, to nurture it, to believe in it.
Upset? I'm not upset. Why makes you think I'm upset?
So why are you upset?
I probably sucked more today than anyone in the history of Kung Fu, in the history of China, in the history of sucking.
Probably.
And the 5. Man, you should have seen them. They totally hate me.
Totally.
How's Shifu ever going to turn me into the Dragon Warrior? I mean, I'm not like the 5. I've got no claws, no wings, no venom. Even Mantis has those thingies. Maybe I should just quit and go back to making noodles.
Quit, don't quit. Noodles, don't noodles. You are too concerned with what was and what will be. The secret ingredient is nothing.
Huh?
You heard me. Nothing. There is no secret ingredient.
Wait. It's just plain old noodle soup? You don't add some kind of special sauce or something?
Don't have to. To make something special, you just have to believe it's special.
There is no secret ingredient.
So, I actually really like that movie. But he's looking at a reflection of himself, and he finally sees himself in his natural state, and he uses his natural panda bear likeness in his ultimate realization of action, his Wu Wei Wu, where he's able to fight the evil guy by using, in comical ways, his own body weight to defeat the person. It's in his complete natural state, and you see that in the earlier part of the video, how he highlights how there's no control with nature, but you have to kind of fully realize yourself in that natural state. So the mythic dimension of Taoism, it's practiced as a religion in various Asian communities, but its theology is not foundationally dependent on the existence of an anthropomorphic godlike figure. Nevertheless, as Taoist beliefs include teachings based on various sources and are often intermingled with Chinese folk religious practice, popular Taoist religious sects have co-opted mythical figures from Chinese folklore as well as actual Taoist personages as figures of worship, with the latter being understood as analogous to saints in the Catholic veneration rather than as divine deities in and of themselves, even though they were also often mythologized to possess superhuman or supernatural powers. So, the Tao in various Taoist traditions or school has been thought of as divine itself, as like a divine-like figure. Like I mentioned, there are Taoist saints that are at least saints thought of in the Western tradition. There's also the Jade Emperor as the official head deity in numerous Taoist sects. And the pantheon tends to mirror the bureaucracy of imperial China. So oftentimes the Jade Emperor is seen as a mirror for the current emperor of whatever dynasty we're talking about. And just like on the earthly kingdoms, deities can also be promoted or demoted based upon their actions. Think of the will of heaven. And oftentimes Lao Tzu is seen as divine, so there's statues of him. He's venerated, he's bowed down to, much like Confucius. But again, we need to be hesitant about thinking of that in a completely Western sense. Here's a really awesome video about how to use the I Ching, and this is kind of highlighting the ritual dimension of Taoism.
The subject today is how do we consult the oracle? The I Ching is an oracle that originated in China about 3,000 years ago. The purpose of this short video is to show you the method of consulting it. The I Ching is organized in 64 chapters called hexagrams. Each hexagram has a name that indicates a specific subject, as for example, making a new beginning, or youthful folly, conflict, or abundance. Each hexagram consists of 6 lines. When we look at this chart that shows all the 64 hexagrams, we notice that only 2 kinds of lines make up the whole system. This is called a dark line, and this is called a light line. The light and the dark lines represent the 2 primary forces that make up the whole cosmos. These 2 forces are complementary to each other. Their complementarity is experienced as the force of attraction that holds all aspects of the cosmos together. The question now is, how do we consult the I Ching oracle? The most common method is to use 3 coins of the same kind. Some people prefer to use Chinese coins, for example, like these. But 3 simple pennies will do just as well. This is actually the method we personally use. The main thing is about a coin that it has 2 sides, a tail and a head. Traditionally, the tail is associated with the value 2 and the head is associated with the value 3. 3 coins are tossed to build a hexagram. The sum total of each toss determines what kind of line we have received. There are basically 4 possibilities that we can receive. Either a simple light line, a simple dark line, a light line that indicates transformation, or a dark line that indicates transformation. Here is a chart that shows us which kind of line we receive depending on the total value of our coin toss. The dots besides the line indicate a possible transformation. When the sum total of our toss is 6 or 9, we receive a line that points to a transformation. A 6 points to a transformation from a dark to a light line. A 9 points to a transformation from a light to a dark line. This refers to a transformation in the energy involved in the situation. It can indicate two possible situations. Either that a transformation has taken place, or that we need to initiate a transformation by bringing our thinking into harmony with the cosmos. I will now demonstrate how to build a hexagram. I take the 3 coins, I throw them with my question in mind. I have received 2 heads and 1 tail. This is 3 plus 3 plus 2 is 8. It is a dark line, a simple dark line. I start building the hexagram from the bottom up. Now I toss my coins for the second line. I have received 2 tails and 1 head, which is 2 plus 2 plus 3 is 7, which means I have received a light line. Now I'm building line 3. Line 3 is the same as line 2, a light line. And the next one has the same value, light line. Now I have again the same line as at the bottom, a dark line, and my last line is also a dark line. Now, if I want to know what the number of this hexagram is out of the 64 hexagrams, I need to divide my hexagram into 2 trigrams. A trigram consists of 3 lines. Each hexagram consists of 2 trigrams. I can look this up in my book. There's a chart here at the end of the book that shows me these trigrams and what combination I have received as a hexagram. The bottom trigram or lower trigram is Sun, 1 dark line and 2 light lines on top of it. And now we look up the upper trigram in this line, and we see it here, 1 light line and 2 dark lines, and we look up where they meet. The number is 32. And now I can look up this hexagram in the book just to see what name it has. 32 is called duration. And again, I can see the depiction of this hexagram that I have received. Right here, we're only concerned with the actual technique of building a hexagram and not with the interpretation. Now, there is a simpler method of getting to a hexagram, which I would like to demonstrate next. This method was developed by a Swiss man called Dominique Rollet, and he has given us the permission to use it. He has developed 6 sticks. Now we can see how each stick stands for a line. And the wonderful thing is now that when I need a hexagram, I can take the 6 sticks in my hand and I have my question in mind, or maybe I simply ask the I Ching to give me a hexagram that will reflect my situation from the inside with all the factors that I cannot see. So I don't have a very specific question. And I go by my feelings. When I feel, I have tossed it enough, now I want to see which hexagram I receive. I do this, and I assemble it. And now I have my hexagram here on the left-hand side. This time I have received one so-called transforming line. And again, we look at the lines from the bottom up. So this is would be line 4 as transforming line. And again, I can easily divide them into 2 trigrams. Now I can look up these trigrams in my chart. What the stick also shows me here is actually this principle of transformation. It shows that a light line that has a dot gets transformed into a dark line, whereas all the others remain unchanged. So this is a very quick method of building a hexagram where we do not need the coins.
Are almost done. We're just going to highlight kind of the social and institutional dimension of Taoism and watch more video, and then we'll be kind of finishing off with Chinese religions. So within this dimension, it's just important probably to highlight the Taoist schools. Taoism is a religion with many schools or denominations, of which none occupy a position of real orthodoxy. Taoist branches usually build their identity around a set of scriptures that are manuals of ritual practices. There are many different schools, but for convenience sake, we're going to just focus on 2, the Shenqing school, or the Supreme Clarity, and the Lingbao school, or the school of the Numinous Treasure, or school of the Sacred Jewel. The Shenqing school is a Taoist movement that began during the aristocracy of the Western Jin dynasty. And Shenqing can be translated as either Supreme Clarity or Highest Clarity. The first leader of the school was a woman, and according to her later biographers, her devotion to Taoist cultivation so impressed a number of immortals that she received revelation from them 31 volumes of Taoist scriptures, which would become the foundation of Shenqing Taoism. The Shenqing practice values meditation techniques of visualization and breathing, as well as physical exercises, as opposed to the use of alchemy and talismans. The recitation of the sacred canon plays an equally important role. The main god of the Shenqing school is known as the Venerable Sovereign, and the pantheon includes gods that could be turned to for help, ones that could be revered, and others that could be commanded even. Now, the Lingbao school was an important Taoist school that emerged in China in between the Jin dynasty and the Lusong dynasty in the early 5th century CE. It lasted for about 200 years until it was actually absorbed into the Shenqing school. The Lingbao school is a synthesis of religious ideas based on Shenqing texts and the rituals of the celestial masters, and even Buddhist practices. The Lingbao school borrowed many concepts from Buddhism, including the concept of reincarnation and also some cosmological elements. Although reincarnation was an important concept in the Lingbao school, the earlier Taoist belief in attaining immortality remained, so even beyond reincarnation. And so those are just kind of 2 different types of schools. There's a whole bunch more. It's important also to reference probably Daoshi in the social and institutional dimension of Taoism. Just refers to a priest in Taoism. According to legend, these Taoist recluses would practice alchemy and austerity in the mountains with the aim of becoming like an immortal being. Alchemy, at least in the West, you probably are familiar with the attempt to turn lead into gold. really what alchemy was, particularly in the context of Taoism, was the attempt to find immortality. So using various elixirs or whatnot to find the quote-unquote philosopher's stone, for you Harry Potter fans, to find a way to achieve an immortal existence. And there's two different types of schools. Well, there's multiple schools, but just to highlight two schools of Daoshi. The Quanjin school, which is dominant in the northern half of the People's Republic of China, have priests that resemble Buddhist monks in that they are celibate, vegetarian, and live in temples. One of the most renowned locations is the White Cloud Temple in Beijing. The other main priesthood is the Zhengi Daoshi, in which the priests can marry, they can eat meat, and they can live in their own homes. They are mostly priests part-time and can hold actually other jobs. They're present all over China, although with very different names according to the local lineages. For example, in northern China, there are the Yin-Yang masters of the Lingbao subtradition. So just kind of some highlights or brief remarks on the kind of diversity within the Taoist institutional dimension of Taoism. And here's a video about a Taoist temple.
This is the largest Taoist shrine in Beijing, and although it was founded in 739 AD, it has been destroyed and rebuilt several times since then. The impressive triple-gated pilau stands at the entrance.
There's a little monkey carved on the gate, and if you rub him till he gets warm, he'll bring you happiness and good luck. And also there are two other little monkeys carved somewhere in the temple. If you find them, rub them too, and they'll also bring you good luck.
Beneath the bridge that leads into the main courtyard are two gongs with bells dangling in their center. You can join in the tradition of chiming the bells with bronze coins thrown from the edge of the bridge. This is meant to bring great luck as you aim to strike the Eye of Wisdom. Based around a series of interconnecting courtyards, the temple is a calm haven that embodies the essence of Taoism, which focuses on right action and good karma. Each hall holds different gods that have a particular influence. People pray to a god for a specific reward that can range from spiritual immortality to earthly riches. The Temple for Immortal Qi has fabulous carvings depicting the life of the master Qi Changchun and his journey to meet Genghis Khan. He is shown riding across the mountains with his small troop of disciples. In the side courtyards, you will find carvings and statues of wonderful charm and beauty, in particular a frieze of the animals of the Chinese zodiac, and a lovely bronze horse. This is very much a working temple. Over 30 monks live in the terraced housing, and the act of worship is very present in the complex. There is an air of peaceful calm in the White Clouds Temple, but it is also an open and friendly place where interaction is encouraged. The monks will guide you through the temple, opening up the history and details of Taoism, and the many rituals that surround their worship and bring you good luck.
All right, and that's just kind of a sample of one of the most well-known temples in Beijing, the White Cloud Temple. All right, so just some summary remarks. Chinese religions are complex and multi-layered with long histories. Like we've already discussed with multiple other traditions, they're not reducible to the modern notion of private belief, even though private beliefs are definitely a considered part of those religions. Chinese religions demonstrate that religion can mean much more, and the current state of religion in China is difficult to determine. So in the discussion this week, you will kind of watch a video and talk about, that relationship between religion and the state. Next week we'll be going over Jainism and actually doing our midterm review. I suggest you, if you can, listen to the whole video for the review because it does make it a lot easier to take the midterm, which is just going to be a multiple choice. And please feel free to email me any questions that you may have. Hope all is well, and I'll see you next week.